I'm Donald McCauley, and welcome to medicsvoices.com, where we talk to the key opinion leaders in healthcare and medicine around the world. Today I'm talking to Hilliard Jason, better known as Hill, who's really quite a radical educationalist. Hill, you've had an interesting career, especially at the very beginning. Tell us about it.
Well, I started medical school in 1953, and very quickly I became disillusioned and disappointed, and I began to try to gently complain and express my concerns about what was being done to all of us in medical school. And I explained that they had promised to help us become humanistic, scientifically sound clinicians. And we were sitting in large lecture halls being taught that by people who didn't even tune in to what we were interested in or what we wanted. And it was mind-numbing and mind-boggling at the same time. And it was my luck to be in the only medical school in the world at that time, of all places, the University of Buffalo in Buffalo, New York, that had a group of faculty, small group, but who were also concerned about medical education's directions. And one young faculty member was working at getting a grant to have the first so-called, it wasn't called yet by that name, but we now recognize it as faculty development. And he invited me to consider something that he hadn't planned on, which was to have a student participant to get a kind of student perspective in this process. So I ended up realizing that this really dull, uninteresting, intellectually stultifying experience of medical school could be enlarged with some people who are actually thinking and wanting to explore ideas and learn what other people are learning. And I said, absolutely. So I agreed to take some time off in the sense of going to medical school half-time, which our dean agreed to, which was amazing. And I ended up pursuing both a medical doctorate and an education doctorate at the same time. And that led to a career at the boundary between medicine and education. And the most relevant specialty seemed to be psychiatry. So I went on to a residency. As it happened, a small additional complication was I was a Canadian and I come from Montreal for this program. And what turned out to be a certifiably disturbed, even psychotic immigration officer decided I was a threat to the Republic and kicked me out of the United States halfway through my residency. But happily, some colleagues and senior people at McGill took me in, and I finished my residency at McGill in Montreal. Then got invited to come back to the States and join the faculty at Rochester.
When we look back on that, I mean, that was quite some time ago. You must have faced considerable opposition with these radical new ideas in education.
Well, that's putting it mildly. Yes, there were people who told me, very senior people at a national level who I had a chance to interact with, was that it was kind of courageous and I suppose even they said admirable for me to be pursuing a doctorate in education with my medical degree, but I was told over and over again, you understand that in medicine that will be no credential at all. Nobody will acknowledge that that's of any value, and we don't quite understand why you're wasting your time with that. Well, within about 10 years, which isn't a long time in the history of medicine, I was asked by the federal government to develop an educational fellowship program for people in medicine who wanted to learn more about education. the landscape started to change, not just thanks to me, but thanks to some other people who were recognizing what was needed. And I think it was 3 of us who were asked to start those fellowship programs. And to my surprise and delight, the very first year, we had an application from a retiring dean of medicine, from a retiring chairman of pediatrics, from several other senior people. And there was a kind of a bubbling awareness that we just weren't doing enough to take what's understood by some good science and education and applying it in the medical setting. The medical setting turned out to be very resistant to change and still is. There are wonderful exceptions to that. There's now good research being done in medical education by leaders in the field. There are changes being made in quite a few medical schools. Unfortunately, as I travel around and I'm in touch with people, there's still medical schools in the world that put hundreds of people in one room at one time and talk at them hour after hour, as if that's supposed to be a form of education, when it's not only neutral, it's negative. It leaves people with a feeling that if I memorize a few facts, I'll get through the exams and I never have to think again. I just do the few things I know how to do. And I narrow my specialization down as much as possible because I don't want to be stuck with unknowns. One of the hallmarks of good primary care, good family medicine, is dealing with the unknown, dealing with the unpredictable. The subspecialties tend to have filtered patients, patients who have already been diagnosed by somebody else and referred to us as subspecialists with a label. And if you're not inclined to good investigation or open to ambiguity and uncertainty, you take those labels, and there's good evidence and good studies of people treating what their specialty offers rather than what the patient needs, which doesn't always fit. And learning to be a doctor who's able to deal reasonably comfortably with ambiguity and uncertainty is not trivial. It takes role models who do that. It takes practice. It takes an environment that encourages humility and caution and investigation. And none of those things are present in some educational programs still in medicine, even though we've known about this and understood it for decades.
I can see very clearly the type of outcome we want and the type of graduate we want. But how do we actually do that? How do we change education so we produce that type of doctor that you suggest, who's able to tolerate uncertainty, etc.?
The very straightforward answer: not easily. That's something that takes specially prepared educators, not just doctors who happen to have a reliable pulse and respiratory rate, which is the only requirement to be an educator in many educational programs. You have to have people who are well prepared, who have thought about these issues, who have explored them, who have gone through literally practice sessions, simulations where one deals with the uncertainty of a student who is uncertain. We know how to do that fairly well, but it takes time and it takes supervision, and we need to use simulation. Most of the world that deals with tough education uses simulation. Medicine is starting to use it, but not nearly enough yet. Simulation is where you can create artificially simplified experiences to practice explicit skills and then gradually add more complexity and develop the capacity of the learners. Educators need to go through such experiences just as their students need to. And these need to be carefully planned.
It looks like we have an enormous challenge here because there's a pressure on medical schools to put through more and more medical students, classes of 100, 150. And at the same time, education isn't valued. Research is valued so much that educators have become, dare I say, almost second-class citizens in universities. How do we overcome this?
There are still medical schools in the world that don't have just hundreds in a class. They have 1,000 or 2,000 in a class. It's just bizarre. And these are people, talk about the blind leading the blind. These are people who don't understand anything about education and don't want to. Meaningful change has to come both from the top and the bottom. There have to be students and young faculty clamoring for change, but you need people at the top who are supportive and encouraging, not resistant, because people at the top can squelch any initiative they want because they are dealing with young people who desperately want credentials. Things happen very slowly.
One of the other influences is the pressure to broaden the base of our medical student grouping. So when we talk about broadening the base of the medical student intake, do you think we're choosing the right medical students?
It's a hugely important question. The human capacity as educators is quite limited. We are not capable of exerting the kind of change that modifies personalities, modifies deeply held attitudes and traditions. The only way to get the product at the end of a process that you want is to choose people at the beginning of the process who are as close to what you want at the end as possible. So we need to have a hugely more sensitive and carefully planned selection process than we often do. We need to be looking for people who can tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty. We need to be looking for people who have a capacity for humane, deep connections with other human beings, because that's at the foundation of earning trust with patients. Without trust, you don't get the whole story. We've known that for a long time. Patients tell doctors what they think the doctor wants to hear and what the doctor might admire rather than criticize. And they have to trust their doctor to be fully honest about what's really troubling them, what's really the most important part of their concerns. We need to pick people very carefully. And how do we do selection now? By looking at how much people have memorized about the outcomes of science, not the process of science, not the way you find reliable information, but how you memorize what other people have told you is the currently believed conclusions of science. That's not the way to choose a future doctor.
Tell me now, as an educational radical for a lifetime, are you optimistic for the future?
I have a lot of reason to be optimistic now. There are people doing really good work in medical education. There's a lot of good research going on. When I was starting out, there was literally no journal devoted to medical education. There was one pretending to be. The Association of American Medical Colleges had a journal called the Journal of Medical Education, but it mostly published opinion pieces by deans. It didn't really publish any research in medical education to speak of, except once in a great while. And then gradually, huge surprise and encouragement and source of optimism is there's not only many journals of medical education now around the world, but medical specialty journals, journals for surgeons, for internists, for gynecologists, are publishing articles on research in medical education within their specialty practice journals. So the world has in fact changed in the more than half a century. Now, for my lifetime, that's a long time. For the history of medicine, that's a relatively short time, which is what leaves me cautiously optimistic.
What a super note to end on, with all the challenges, to end on a positive and optimistic note. You know, Hill, you've done an immense amount for medical education. I'm sorry we were only able to touch very briefly on the surface. Thank you very much indeed.